You know, I took the opportunity this past week to ask a few people that I bumped into this question. When you think about the book of Psalms, what sorts of things come to mind? And the answers were probably not surprising to anybody. Some of the answers were very specific, and I had a number of individuals that would actually take the time to tell me their favorite psalm and why it was their favorite. I had some individuals tell me about a life group study that they had done and how impactful it had been in their life. Typically, when I ask people, they would say, well, when I think of the book of Psalms, I usually think of David. I usually think of Solomon. Had one individual say this to me: I often think about the poetry and songs and the laments that we have access to because of this very meaningful collection of thoughtful and profound writings. What we don't often think about when we're thinking about the book of Psalms is Moses. And yet, as we've just heard, Moses is credited with the writing of this very powerful prayer. There's no debate amongst scholars that this is the oldest psalm that we have. And it's believed that it was written around 1450 BC, when, I might add, Moses was at the ripe old age of 120 years old. I want to suggest to you this morning that one of the things that makes this such a powerful psalm for us to know and understand has everything to do with who Moses was and how God chose to reveal himself to Moses throughout his life. And because of the fact that these words came directly from Moses' lips, we really do need to stop and listen and take them seriously. When he wrote this prayer, most scholars believe that he was likely at the end of his life or very close to the end of his life. Most scholars believe that the psalm was, in many ways, the culmination of how his understanding of God had evolved. And most scholars believe that after all Moses had been through in his life, that these words in many ways are a summary of who Moses had discovered God to be. And one of the things that I think is important that we do before we start to unpack this powerful prayer is that we need to remind ourselves of all that Moses, in his 120-year life, had experienced with God. We know that he was born in Egypt while God's chosen people were slaves. We know that he was born to Hebrew parents, but that he was placed in a reed basket and set in the Nile when he was just 3 months old, in an effort to save him from an edict calling for the death of all newborn Hebrew males. We know that while floating in the Nile, he was found by one of Pharaoh's daughters, and subsequently he was raised in the Egyptian court. He was raised as royalty. We know that when he was 40 years old, that he killed a brutal Egyptian taskmaster, and he ran away from Egypt out of fear, and he ended up in Midian. We know that while he was in Midian, he had this profound encounter with God, when God revealed himself in a burning bush and called Moses to be the one to deliver the nation of Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. We know that Moses made all kinds of excuses why it was that he couldn't do it. But not that many months later, he was standing in front of Pharaoh and was pleading for Pharaoh to release the Israelites. We know that he did that when he was 80 years old. We know that Pharaoh ended up letting the Israelites go, but it was only after God demonstrated his power by sending this series of horrible plagues on the land. We know that after letting them go, that Pharaoh ended up changing his mind. And he sent his armies after the Israelites, but God parted the Red Sea using Moses and his staff, which allowed the Israelites to pass through, but it also ended up drowning the pursuing Egyptian army. In the last 40 years of Moses' life, We know that God made a covenant with Moses and the Israelites, a covenant that he would deliver to Moses on Mount Sinai. And interestingly enough, Moses would end up, over the course of his life, climbing up and down that mountain at least 8 times. And he interacted with God every time he was up there. We know that because of the Israelites' disobedience, that they weren't allowed to enter the land that God had promised them. And they were made to wander in the wilderness for, as you know, 40 years. We know that under Moses' leadership, the nation of Israel would sin. They would lose their faith. They would lose their trust in God. They would at numerous times decide to go their own way. And we know that during that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, we know that there were ups and downs. We know that there were hills and valleys. We know that there were times of worshiping. There were times of complaining. We know that there were times of peace and that there were times of war. And we know that Moses continued to lead his people all throughout that wandering until finally they reached the edge of the promised land, where Moses wrote this psalm, and then he passed away. Okay, I'm sure by now many of you are sitting there thinking, really nice history lesson, Bruce, but how does that really play in to this psalm? How does knowing that and reminding ourselves of that help us as we're unpacking what this psalm has to say to us today? Well, one of the reasons I think that we need to remind ourselves of who Moses was is because if you had the opportunity to sit down with Moses today, wouldn't you want to know, after all that he had been through, and after all that he had seen God do throughout his journey, and after being up on Mount Sinai and having no less than 8 encounters with God up there, and after being the one that stood by the burning bush with God, hearing his audible voice, and after being the one to see God miraculously save the nation of Israel from slavery, and after seeing God destroy the Egyptian army, and after seeing God manifest himself in a cloud of fire, after experiencing all of that, after experiencing all the riches and the poverty and the joy and the pain, all of his successes and his failures throughout his journey, wouldn't you want to know what all that taught him about the God that he spent most of his life serving? I mean, wouldn't you want to know what wisdom he would want us as committed followers of that same God to know? Wouldn't you want to know, after the way that he saw God work in his own life, what he learned that could help us as we now interact with that same God? Well, I believe that this psalm is Moses' attempt to tell us all of that. And I want to suggest to you that there are a number of important things that we can take away from this passage. But I want to suggest this morning that there are 4 main ones. And he gives us our first takeaway in the first couple of verses. And this is what he says. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And I don't know if Moses could start in a more appropriate place than this, to remind us that God is God and we are not. And it's almost as if he needs to get this off his chest before he can go any further. And he wants to make the point that before he says anything else, we need to understand this. And this isn't some abstract concept that he read in a book or heard in a message, maybe listened to in a podcast. But this was his personal experience after all that he had been through with God. He's telling those that are willing to listen that before he can share anything else with them, they need to make sure that they have the eternal pecking order straight. They need to understand that even before the mountains were brought forth, And even before you formed the earth and the world, from everlasting, you are God. And you have to wonder if this wasn't something that Moses, in many ways, had to learn the hard way. As you read through his life, you see that there were so many times when he found himself arguing with God. I often find it funny when we read the story of Moses and the burning bush. I mean, Moses actually had the nerve in Exodus 3 to question whether God knew what he was doing. Picture this. God's voice is speaking to Moses from this burning bush, and yet the shock and the awe of what Moses is seeing with his eyes and hearing with his ears and likely feeling the heat of that burning bush on his flesh. He's experiencing that, and yet in that moment, I think he was overwhelmed. I think he was scared. I think he was panicking. I think his insecurities were coming out in that moment. But in Psalm 90, it's as if he's looking back. It's as if he's pausing. He's reflecting on a God that had been faithful to him throughout the aftermath of that specific encounter. I mean, God gave him what he needed in those moments. He gave him what he needed in those conversations with Pharaoh. God gave him the wisdom that he had asked God for. God answered his questions. He calmed Moses' fears. He helped him to work through his insecurities. And God continued to help him by giving him all that he needed, all throughout that 120-year journey that Moses had with him. And his conclusion at the end of that was what he says in these verses. He says, God is God, and I am not, and we need to learn the difference. You know, when you take a look at Moses' time on earth, his life was filled with all kinds of these moments when God asks him to do something. And it was at times almost this knee-jerk reaction that Moses had to question God. But isn't it interesting now, as he writes this psalm in this moment of reflection, that he can look back, as I'm sure that many of us can do in our own lives. And it's so easy to see how God's faithfulness has been so present in those moments where we particularly needed it to be. You know, as a pastor, I've had the opportunity on a number of occasions to be with people at their bedside as they've been just days or hours, sometimes minutes away from passing away. And not always, but sometimes these are the types of things that you hear people talking about. That is God's faithfulness. I've had conversations with people who in those moments reflect back on times when they needed God to show up, and God showed up. And in many ways, when you think about it, Moses had a front row seat to watching how God was shaping the people of Israel into a community that he hoped would represent him well. And understand that God was faithful in those moments, and God did show up. Moses had a front row seat to the plagues. He had a front row seat to the crossing of the Red Sea. He had a front row seat to seeing the cloud of fire, the Red Sea parting, the Egyptian army being wiped out, finding the manna on the ground each morning, just like God said would happen. He had a front row seat as God met with him on Mount Sinai. He was an eyewitness to seeing God's chosen people victorious in battles that they had no business being in. And don't lose sight of the fact that at the end of Moses' life, Moses' conclusion was that you are God and I am not. He goes on in verses 3-6 to say this. He says, you return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. And in these verses, Moses is reminding us that God is eternal and we are not. And in a very graphic kind of way, he's reminding us that at the end of the day, we will all be once again turned to dust. He's reminding us that in the end, these earthly shells that we call a body will all eventually end up in the same place. You know, just a few days before Mark Twain passed away, he wrote these words. He says, "A myriad of men are born. They labor and sweat and struggle. They squabble and scold and fight. They scramble for advantages over each other. Age creeps upon them. Infirmities follow. Those they love are taken from them, and the joy of life is turned to aching grief. The release comes at last, and they vanish from a world where they were of no consequence, a world which will lament them a day and then forget them forever." Now, isn't that an encouraging thought for us this morning? But you know, when you read this section of Psalm 90, I've often wondered what it was that Moses was thinking about as he was penning these words. I've wondered if he wasn't reflecting back on the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness when an entire generation was told that they would not be able to enter the promised land because of their disobedience and their lack of trust. And the very real consequence of that disobedience was the death of an entire generation of Israelites. Just think about that for a minute. Think about what that must have meant. I mean, over that 40 years, it's estimated that over 1 million people would have died. And if you do the math, that would work out to roughly 70 funerals a day. And you have to wonder if maybe all that death that Moses was surrounded with every day brought him to the point in his own life where he needed to grasp this truth, that although God is eternal, these earthly shells that we have aren't. Again, he says in verse 5 and 6, he says, "You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers." And it's true of all of us, isn't it? We're here today and we are gone tomorrow. And this earthly life isn't something that Moses is being casual about when he talks about it. But he's challenging us to put it into perspective. And he's challenging us to think about life in relation to eternity. But for many of us here this morning, that's likely not something that we take even as an encouraging thought in this particular moment. Because, I mean, let's be honest with each other. There are earthly things that bring us happiness and joy. I mean, we don't want to leave our families. There are things on this earth that bring us a sense of joy. There are things on this earth that give our lives meaning. There are things that we want to experience and accomplish. We're not ready to go yet. You know, I want to grow old with Monica. I want to see my kids grow up. I want to watch my granddaughter Danny as she continues to grow. You know, but Moses is telling us here that there's something healthy about understanding that these temporal, earthly, deteriorating shells that we call our bodies, that they're not going to last forever. And I think Moses wants all of us to understand that there's something healthy and hopeful that comes from reminding ourselves, for those of us who are committed followers of that same God, that this earth is not our home, that we have been sent here as ambassadors, and that our mindset is to be living as aliens in a strange land. And Moses says, one day you will be swept away as with a flood. But there's an incredibly powerful takeaway for us that's found in this next section. So Moses is helping us to understand that God is God, we are not. God is eternal, and we are not. But he also needs us to understand that God's view of time is often not our view of time. You know, I have a brother-in-law who's an authorized Apple dealer, and you might be thinking that that means he sells apples for a living. That isn't true. But what it does mean is that he has some businesses that use a lot of computer equipment, and he can purchase Apple products directly from the company. And it's because of him that I have an iPad Pro, a MacBook Pro, a fancy iPhone that I am not even close to using to the extent that I should be. And a few months ago, he introduced me to an Apple Watch. Prior to that, I had a Fitbit, which is a watch that can track your steps. It can track your heart rate. If you get a text or email, it'll show up on the screen of your watch. And the most surprising feature of that Fitbit is that it could actually tell time. You remember when that was all we expected from our watches? Well, my brother-in-law, after seeing my Fitbit, decided that I needed a upgrade from my Fitbit. So the technology that I'm wearing on my wrist this morning can actually do more things that many years ago were beyond the capability of some of the world's most sophisticated computers. And you'll be happy to know it can also tell time. But you know, the reason why so many people in our world today and in our culture today invest so much money into the latest and greatest technology is because deep down, I believe, there is a sincere desire to want to be more efficient in the way that we spend our time. The problem is, and I'm sure most of you have discovered this, is a technology that's designed to save us time and make us more efficient is often that very thing that steals our time from the things that we say are most important to us. And I wonder how our perspective, even on that technology, would change if we were to fully grasp what Moses was saying in this passage. Starting in verse 10, he says, "The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away." And then in verse 12, this is what he says. He says, "So teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom." I want you to recite this verse with me. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. And the point that Moses is trying to make here is that it really doesn't matter how strong you are. You know, it doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter how much you work out. It just, at the end of the day, really doesn't matter, because at the end, and because of sin, all of us, our days are numbered. I mean, you might prolong your days by doing some of those things, but at the end, God might give you 50 years, maybe 60, maybe some of you might live to 100. I don't think many of us will live to 120 like Moses did. But his conclusion was this: "Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away." And that's an inevitability. But it gets better than that, because Moses is trying to help us to understand that life on earth is really just a drop of water in the ocean. He told us, God is God and we are not. God is eternal and we are not. God's view of time is not our view of time. And remember, verse 12, he offers us some help with this. Again, I'll read it again. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Again, I want you to recite this with me. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Moses is saying here, teach us to look at our time here on earth through an eternal tint in our spiritual glasses. He's saying, teach us what it means to hold on to these earthly things loosely. Teach us what it means to see the different periods in our life, both the good ones as well as the bad ones, the ups and downs, the hills and valleys. Lord, help us to see those as God-ordained seasons. Jesus really said the same thing in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6 as he's speaking to this hugely diverse crowd, some who believe in him, some who don't. Some are there because they think they're going to get fed. Others are there because they want to trap him. This is what he says to them in Matthew 6, starting in verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. And I believe that Jesus may even been echoing Moses' statements here when he concludes this in verse 21 and says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Well, the fourth and final reminder that Moses wants to leave with us in Psalm 90 is simply this, that since God is God, and God is eternal, and God's view of time is different than ours, then let's make the most of the time that we have. Moses writes this, let your work be shown in your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And the whole phrase of asking God to establish the work of our hands is really a call. It's a request to help us focus our lives on those things that matter most. It's a plea to help us make the most of the limited time that everybody in this room is given. In Hebrews chapter 11, that incredible chapter that is labeled in most of our Bibles as heroes of the faith, Moses, as you know, is listed as being a hero of the faith. But the reason he's labeled as a hero might surprise you. I mean, nobody would question that he should be there among that incredible list of other heroes worthy of emulating our life after. And we could probably spend time this morning talking about the different reasons why it is that that's a rightful place for him to be mentioned. But the reason given by the author of Hebrews is fascinating. Hebrews 11, 24 to 26, this is what we're told. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Now, just let that sink in for just a minute, what that means. Moses is declared a hero of the faith because when the line was drawn in the sand, he chose to side with the God of his people. When the line was drawn in the sand, he considered the reproach of Christ as greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. And we're told that he was looking towards the reward that was what? That was eternal, rather than the temporal rewards that this world offers to all of us. And I love the way verse 26 closes. Simply says that he was looking to the reward. Moses had his eyes on the prize, You know, he wasn't willing to sacrifice his heavenly treasures for some fleeting, temporary, earthly ones. And Moses' final charge in verse 17 of Psalm 90 really is a cry for you and I to live for something greater than ourselves. It was maybe even his final request to anybody who would be open to listening. Anyone who was bold enough to accept this challenge. Anyone who cared enough to understand what all of his very full life had taught him. He says, let the favor of the Lord, our God, be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Moses isn't saying, bless what we want to do. He's saying, Lord, let your favor be upon us because we have allowed you to establish the work of our hands. Yes, Lord, you be the one to establish the work of our hands. And it's my prayer this morning that that would be something personal to each of us. May the Lord help us to represent him well as we do the work that he has given our hands to do. One more time, recite this with me. So teach us to number our days that we might get a heart of wisdom. Jesus, I thank you for this.